Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
Dr. Jodie Skillicorn is board certified in psychiatry and neurology and a diplomat of the American Board of Holistic Integrative Medicine. Dr. Skillicorn is the author of the book Healing Depression Without Medications, subtitled A Psychiatrist's Guide to Balancing Mind, Body, and Soul. Well, Dr. Skillicorn, thank you for being here. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, too.
I'm hoping you can regale us with some stories of how you deal with identifying and then remedying the effects of trauma in your work with people.
Sure. So, to start with, and we were just talking about this, but right, this is not something that's really mentioned in medical school, even though, right, we now know that, right, these childhood events increase the risk for just about every chronic disease you can think of, right? It quadruples the risk of COPD. It doubles the risk of heart disease and cancer and strokes, and like the links are crazy and significant, and yet they're not a part of general medicine and even psychiatry, which just blows my mind, right? Psychiatry of all the professions should at least be taught this, and we were taught, right? We were taught kind of traditional psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and we know that what happens as a child affects what happens in the future, but doesn't change anything in how you treat the person, right? You still, traditionally in psychiatry, you still are just handing out medications, which is ridiculous to think that you can kind of just numb a soul wound with a biochemical solution.
Exactly.
And what's worse is, right, these childhood traumas, they 90%, what these studies show is 97% of people with these end up with 4 or more of these traumas. So that could be the ones we think about, so physical, sexual, or verbal abuse, but it could also be neglect. It can be if your own parent has depression and they're just cut off from you or neglected, or the loss of a parent, whether it's from, an actual death, but also just, they're not in your space. There's so many different witnessing abuse, and then now they've added things, it's obviously things like bullying and poverty and discrimination, and all of these things, change how our brain and our body, the structure and function of our physiology and our nervous system, and changes the shape and structure of the brain. And so it has profound effects. And yet we ignore it and treat it as if it's just, a box on a intake, which is crazy because it really kind of explains everything. It starts this whole series of events. So by changing the structure, the body becomes, right, it induces sort of this chronic vigilance, this hypervigilance, and the body's on guard and tense and always looking out for, another something bad to happen. And so now we're secreting all these hormones and all this inflammation, and it's hard to kind of settle and regulate the system. So then we start looking for other ways to do it. And so you can find that in alcohol and drugs and sugar and eating and not eating and keeping busy and being perfect, or giving up and not doing anything, or self-harming, cutting, or whatever. All these things are all related to these coping skills. They're all ways to try to find some way to manage these early events. And so to ignore that is, it makes no sense whatsoever. And so I think the important thing is when I see people, so I take a couple of hours and to really get their story and kind of see all the pieces. And then as going through it, even just by asking the questions, I think there's healing that happens. And in fact, there are studies showing that by asking these questions, even if it's just on a survey in a pediatrician office or in an internist office, that even just asking the question on a survey has been shown to reduce the number of doctor visits in the future, right? It's just acknowledging what's happened, because so often it just gets buried under the rug and ignored. And then the medical community does the exact same thing. We just ignore it.
So do you ask the ACEs questions? Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, in her book, The Deepest Well, she talks about how they took that original 10-item ACEs question and they modified it so that when people do the assessment, they can just give a score at the end and not tell which ones they identified, so that it frees up the people even more to be honest about how much trauma or how many adverse childhood events they experienced, and or how many adverse childhood events their children have experienced. Do you have something similar that you use in your practice? I
use the standard one, but I ask a lot of other questions. And as they're telling me the story, again, we spend a long time going through their story. So I have that advantage as a psychiatrist versus as a pediatrician, right? You don't have as much time. It is interesting to me how sometimes people will tell me, but not write it on the form. And sometimes people will write it on the form, but not tell me. So I think there's a real value in
doing both.
Doing both, because it's whichever way people feel comfortable. They'll put a couple on their form, but then when we're talking, other stuff comes up. But then sometimes I'll have a whole conversation and then they'll send me the form afterwards, because not everyone gives it to me right away. And then all these other things, it's like then they're willing to tell me. So yeah, I think asking is the most important thing. And if you don't hear it the first time, I often hear other psychiatrists, I'll ask, well, they'll be talking about a patient and I'll be asking about these ACEs and they'll be like, oh no, there's nothing. And I'll be like, nothing? Like really nothing? Because it's pretty rare. So, I mean, even in the initial study in a middle-class white, mostly white area, it was 67% have at least one.
Yep.
In the world, there was a survey of, I think, 23 countries, and they found that at least a third. But then when they looked at people that actually have mental health issues, it was closer. It was more over 70%.
Right.
So it's the majority of us. It's not the minority. And so I'm always skeptical when nothing pops up, because to me, that just means nothing's been acknowledged yet, but there's still maybe something lurking. So that's kind of where I start, is just laying that out. And then even as they're talking, really keep reflecting back, like acknowledging what they've been through, because they often don't think of it that way. They don't think of it as trauma. They just think this was their life. It's all they knew, right? And whatever's normal to us is normal to us. So if you're screamed at, that's normal. Even if you're hit, well, they had to, I was bad. There's so many ways our brain works around that to find that it's justified. Well, usually people see it as it's my fault.
Yeah. Well, and I've worked with people. One of the most striking was a woman, a mature woman. She's in her 70s, and she was recounting an episode where she and her young sister were getting whipped with a riding crop on their legs by their mother. And her impression of it every time she had the memory was her poor mother, how sad it was that her mother had gotten saddled, pardon the pun, tying with the riding crop, with two such horrible children that she had to whip them to get them to behave. I mean, that was really the way she had internalized it.
Yeah, and I think that's not uncommon to internalize it. I mean, I think that's the way we almost have to internalize it, because to think that the people that are responsible for our well-being and the people that are providing us with safety and all our needs when we're small are unstable and can't be trusted, or...
Right. It's easier to think it's my fault, and then maybe I can get it right the next time, and then I don't have to.
It gives me a sense of control. Yeah.
So, one of the things that comes up when we talk about this is, so if I've got, an assessment and somebody comes along and says, well, look, some of your problems are formed because you had 5 or 6 of these adverse childhood events. And then the question is, so now what do you do? Right?
Now we need to.
Does that become an excuse for just staying stuck, or does that actually inform procedures or treatments that might help me? How do you approach that?
I mean, I always approach it from absolutely. It can, if you work through this stuff, if you and you can start to regulate the nervous system, because that's what's become dysregulated primarily. If we can calm it and let the body know that it's safe now, and if we can kind of work with those pieces and parts that were traumatized back then and let them know they're okay, like the parts that got sort of frozen in time when events happened. But it's not to say that, that there will never be any symptoms or that you'll never get re-triggered, because we all get triggered by stuff. We all have stuff that we react to. At least I don't know anyone that doesn't. Maybe you do, but right, most of us get triggered by things. And so the work is to learn how to manage that and to learn how to calm our nervous systems in any given moment, so that we're not, even if we're temporarily kind of overcome by it, we don't have to stay in that place for very long. And as we get better and better at it and build more and more resilience, then we have the capacity to handle more and more. And so I think that's the goal, is to learn to, one, I think you can shift the story around, right? So that there's stuff to be gained from it, and also to heal these pieces and parts and to calm the nervous system. And so I think those are the main tools. So I always just start with breathing, right? Because breathing is fundamental to our nervous system. Almost everyone that comes to me, they're breathing tight, shallow breaths up in their chest, which is sending this constant signal to the brain that there's some kind of threat, right? It might be a low level threat, but it's there. Something's happening, even if you're just sitting watching TV. And so that's constantly happening, and we're just amping up the nervous system. And again, we're just on guard. But if we can learn to just breathe into the belly, right, we can send that signal of safety. So the vagal nerve then gets activated when we breathe deeper breaths into the belly, and it winds up to the nervous system and lets the brainstem and the limbic system know that in this moment, everything's okay. And so it can finally turn off the high alert, and the body can relax and have a chance to heal. But that can't happen if we're constantly on guard.
So you prescribe specific breathing techniques?
Yeah, well, I always work first to kind of explore theirs to see what their breath is, right? So no particular technique per se, but to be curious about what's going on for them, and to start to notice, because just by starting to notice the body, that too helps to start to integrate the brain, right? Because so many people, when they're traumatized, live up here in their head. Well, in our society, most of us live in our heads most of the time. We've sort of just become disconnected from everything below. And what does come up, then we get scared. We assume it's a threat, versus sort of learning to be curious about these sensations, even the racing heart and, faster breath, and just noticing how these changes affect us, and noticing that they come and go, and they're not threats, they're just information. But that's not something most of us learn, let alone if we're traumatized, and we have even more reason to kind of stay up in the head, because the body can become a scary place.
And then when I'm breathing in that shallow or constricted way, or I'm learning to live at a level where my muscles are so tight that I'm
right.
Then what does that do to the hormonal system? What does that do to the rest of the complementary systems?
Yeah, I mean, it causes massive inflammation in every system and imbalance in every system, because the body never gets a chance to regulate. So I think when we talk about neurochemical imbalances, what we're really talking about is a dysregulated nervous system that's causing everything to get imbalanced. The endocrine system, the nervous system, the cortisol spewing out, and just we're in fight, flight, freeze. From that space, we can't, it's hard to regulate. So the goal is to get out of that. And to keep, and over time, to keep letting our body learn to self-regulate better, and so we don't get as easily hijacked.
So when I'm breathing and I'm softening and I'm settling down, what's the next step when you're if you were working with me and I had several aces and you say, wow, the breath is all real tight.
So the next
then what?
So the next step is one, to have them be practicing that, because it's not just going to work if we just do it in the office once a week or once every couple of weeks, right? So what the research shows is by practicing that for 20 minutes a day, so it can be 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes at night, or 5, 5, and 5. And often people start just at 5, and that's fine. But the more it's practiced over time, what the research shows is in a period of 6 to 8 weeks, you can actually change the shape, the structure and function of the brain, which I think is phenomenally amazing, right? That simple thing can do more than any medication, right? It's changing fundamentally the like root of the dysregulation. And if you stop doing it, right, things will get a little more dysregulated, but that's okay too, because then what patients start to notice is what power they actually have, right? Often people do it and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. I'm so much calmer already. And then they'll start to feel really good, and then they stop doing it. And then a couple of weeks later, they're like, hey, I don't know why I'm feeling so lousy. And almost always it comes back to, well, they stop taking care of their nervous system. And so it's just then often just a matter of going back in.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I had a young man that had exactly that. Some breath work and some vitamins made a dramatic change. And then he got a different job, and he went on and came back 2 months later, and he's in the pits again. And when I started questioning him, the two things he quit were the vitamins and the breath work.
Right. It's always the first to go. Yeah. And so often it's just a reminder then, like, okay, remember this worked before. Let's just start this again. But sometimes it is, there's almost always at least some effect from just those simple things. And then, in terms of the trauma itself, I do sort of a combination of EMDR and EFT and somatic therapy. So just really constantly coming back to the body. And I kind of just blend them together in my in my own kind of just whatever's kind of coming up in a conversation. So I'll just have, if people start to get or telling me a story and they're getting triggered, and I can see they're getting triggered, right? They're starting to get more emotional, their breath starting to get shallow, right? Their shoulders are starting to go up to their ears. You can see the tension building. So even just then, I'll have them, so they can keep telling the story, I just have them start tapping. So basic kind of EMDR kind of idea. And as they're telling it, to really start to notice, okay, what's happening in the body? What are the thoughts that are coming up? How are those affecting my body? And just really being aware, and trying to integrate it at the same time, so that the right and left side of the brain can integrate that information that often is stuck when there's trauma. It often gets stuck on that right side, right, which doesn't have a way to communicate. It's the other side of the brain that has the ability to have language and create a narrative. And so that in order to kind of integrate those two sides, the tapping can be really helpful.
Well, and the other thing you mentioned is the idea that if I'm a child and I'm faced with an adverse event, I create a story that makes it the most tolerable, yes, whatever that would take, whether it's blaming myself or someone else. And what comes to me so often is how much this culture that we live in, the Western culture, is focused on blame. Let's figure it out. Let's fix blame. And so, as you were saying, it's so difficult for a child to formulate a story that makes sense and will leave them feeling safe if they blame the adult or the perpetrator of this adversity that they're experiencing. And so they create and kind of integrate a story about how they are to blame.
Yes.
And one of the things that's so liberating for the people I work with is that we create an explanation that isn't blaming anybody. That's just saying, look, if you had parents that didn't do such a good job at parenting, it's because they had parents that didn't do such a good job of parenting. And
right. And that intergenerational trauma.
They were doing the best they could in the moment with whatever resources they have.
Yeah.
And you did the best you could in each moment with whatever resources you have.
Yeah.
And this is the result. How do we shift the result in your body chemistry?
Right. And as an adult, we have that, right, that it's our responsibility. Yeah. And to do it with kindness towards ourselves for.
And I like Diedrich Wolzak has some work he does, the choose again method. And the core of that is that he recognizes that we aren't going to go back and change the events that happened in my history, but it's not the events that happen in my history that are creating the havoc in my life right now. It's the meaning that I gave them and downloaded. And then every time those memories get activated and those meanings come back up, that's what's creating my response. Oh, this means I'm in danger and I have to get tight and tense. And this means I have to run.
Yeah.
And if I can change the meaning that I attributed to those past events, when those memories get resonated, I have a different response.
Yeah. And that's where I think that's another way EMDR, I think, can be really powerful.
Exactly.
Because when you go back and you kind of can see that younger you in that scenario and see how small and powerless they may have been in that moment, and even and kind of soothe that younger part and kind of see it more clearly. And then often what comes around is just like you said, you start to have some compassion for the other person. But I like to do I train with Laurel Parnell, and she brings in a lot of resources as well, which I love, right? So bringing in that moment, although we can't change the event, we can change how we hold it in our nervous system.
Right.
And so although no one may have been there to help us then, with the resourcing, you can sort of imagine someone else there with you, human, animal, spirit, so that you're not alone in it and you do have support. And although, right, fundamentally, that's not true, that isn't what happened. The truth is, though, that our nervous system doesn't necessarily know the difference between reality and what we imagine. And so much of this trauma is what we're telling ourselves anyway. It's a story, like you said, that we've been telling and that we're holding on to. And as you shift that story, it's just held differently in the body. And so in a way, you are kind of changing.
Exactly. And
not the actual event, but the meaning and the
and like you just said, the nervous system doesn't know the difference between 10 years ago and now. If it's getting activated now, the nervous system's responding as though it's happening now.
Exactly.
And I remember, I forget who it was that I saw working with somebody, and they were adamant about it. This did happen to me, and I had this very traumatic birth. And the person working with them says, yes, that did happen, and you're not being born right now.
Right.
And it's that bizarre truth that my nervous system doesn't really keep track of time. If it gets the signal somehow from the body or the mind or the combination of the two in a feedback loop that I need to tighten and tense and be ready for an attack, it thinks right now I'm being attacked, and I'm sitting in the comfort of my office, and maybe I have a really empathic therapist with me that's trained with all kinds of tools. But if I can't access that awareness, and I'm just being driven by what's being activated from my memory and the meanings I attributed to it way back when the trauma got downloaded, that's what drives the system, and that's what drives my response.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so all of that can be changed. And that's the beautiful thing about it. It doesn't have to be a death sentence, and it can be actually really transformative, right? Because I feel like a lot of the people that have experienced these things but work through them, they have such wisdom and compassion for others, and have so much to offer, because of the experience and because of what they've learned and because they've survived it and because they know how hard it can be.
So there's another aspect that, and you mentioned the somatic aspect of therapy. There's another aspect that a lot of people integrate into this kind of work, which is movement.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any aspect or specific aspect of that you bring into your work with your patients?
Yeah, so I think movement really is important, especially some people can't yet sort of sit still and breathe. And so one of my favorite things to do is so simple, but it's the most ancient form of meditation, expressive meditation. There's pictures on cave walls going back, I think, like 10,000 years. But it's literally just to stand and just shake, right? Because that's what, when you look at the National Geographic videos of like a hyena running away from a tiger and assuming the hyena escapes, the hyena will then just shake their body and just release all that cortisol that's been like flooded into the system, all that adrenaline. And then they can just go back to just being, eating the grass and drinking water and being, okay. But we, especially when it's an experience where we're sort of powerless to move or do anything, right? When we're just kind of stuck, everything just floods our system and it just gets stuck there and has no release. So shaking is just an amazing way to start to release both what's happening right here, right now, but also I think I find I use shaking regularly myself, like to just release stuff we don't even know is holding on. It just allows the system to move, and wherever energy is stuck, it gets to free itself.
And Peter Levine talks about that in his work with several events that he's had, and how he encountered the first responders, the EMTs, that would try to stop the shaking and strap people down. And he understood the benefit of letting the shaking, the vibrating, the getting the energy out, let that happen.
Yeah.
And then you don't lock it in the system.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we train, not strapping people down, but even kids, right? We kind of train them not, right? In a way, what is a temper tantrum? It's like a way to release, right? It's a way of shaking and releasing all this frustration that doesn't have an outlet. And so often we're like, so many kids are punished for that or shamed for that, but really it's a healthy way to, definitely at some point it needs to be channeled into, so it's not taken out at others, but it is a way to, it's a primitive way of, kind of letting all that go. So yeah, I love shaking. So I'll do that often with my patients. We just get up and start shaking when they're distracted and stuck. And then the other thing I've been doing a lot of, yoga, I think, is tremendous. So I recommend yoga to a lot of people. Again, it's a great way to get in touch with the body and to feel it in a different way and in a safe way, and to let things move and to let things unlock. And then lately I've been teaching actually a lot of my patients Qigong as well, since I've been doing my own training. And I use the sounds as well, which are useful for just letting go of old emotional residue. And patients really seem to like that. And I know for me, it's been tremendously helpful as well. But just, again, so many cultures, right, use voice and tone to chanting, release that different, energy as well in a different way. So that with some gentle movements, I think can be a really powerful way as well, especially for people that some people, don't like the shaking. Most people do, but especially older people aren't, like, it can be a little hard on the body. I think you can do it gently and most anyone can do it, even if it's just seated. But the Qigong is just nice and slow and gentle, but it's still movement. And then if you add the sounds in, that can be really powerful. But yeah, movement in whatever form it is, whether it's just walking every day outside in nature, right? All of that, movement's essential, or else everything gets stuck. We can't move it.
Well, and I'm surprised by how many people don't even know about the lymph system in the body and how it only gets really activated and moving if you're moving.
Right. I mean,
it doesn't have a heart pumping it. It's got movement that gets it.
That's the only way that gets it moving. Yeah. And in our world, our sedentary world, we're all, it's not surprising that we get sick more often. And then on top of that, if you're not sleeping well, right? So that's how we clear out the lymphatic fluids in the brain, is while we're sleeping. And so if that's not happening, then we can build up all those toxins build up.
Yeah, all the metabolic waste.
No problem.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
All the metabolic waste from our day's activities don't
Yeah.
get flushed out if we don't get a good, rhythmic, light sleep, deep sleep cycle several times a night. And
Exactly.
changes the entire flow of the cerebral spinal fluid through the brain to do the cleansing that needs to happen.
Right.
But that's another thing that, so many people don't even ask about is the sleep and the sleep deprivation. So many symptoms that people take into their psychologist or psychiatrist are part of the checklist of sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
It's a reason that every, brainwashing and torture technique ever devised has sleep deprivation incorporated into it, because it really screws up the system and our ability to perceive accurately and tolerate stress and remember and focus. And
absolutely. I mean, you should see me on one day without sleep. I mean, I can't, everything's just, I'm snappier, and, you do that over time, and you're going to react to everything. There's no way to control it, really. Yeah. Sleep's a tough one though, because again, so they're linked, right? Obviously more traumas, insomnia is a piece of that. So it's a big vicious circle. I think that can be a tricky one, but I think all the same things are useful, right? Again, the breathing and the movement. If we move and exercise during the day, our body, it's easier to fall asleep at night. I often actually have people shake right before they go to bed to release all the stuff from the day, right? And then it's easier to fall asleep. And to have some kind of a ritual, right? So yoga can be really used for that, or just putting your legs up the wall, or some herbs, or not herbs, like some oils can be helpful. But sleep is a tricky one. I have a hard time at times helping people sleep, and people are so desperate and they just want meds, but the meds actually make it so much harder. And I have a hard time explaining that to people, right? Everyone thinks, because of the way it's advertised, that if you just take a pill, you're just going to fall asleep. But what all the research shows is that pills like Ambien or benzo, they offer, like the studies all show that it's about 15 minutes of extra sleep. But the cost is it actually disrupts your sleep pattern,
right,
and creates a bigger problem down the road. And so it's this constant battle, right, of people just keep wanting to go back to them. And it really is a matter of kind of retraining the system. And again, calming the nervous system so that it knows that it's safe to sleep. And again, if you've had trauma, it may not have been safe to sleep.
Exactly.
And so you got to work through that.
I don't know how many, maybe 10 or 15 years since I've checked it out, but as of 10 or 15 years ago, when I was checking this out, every medication that I ever ran across for sleep had as one of its long-term side effects, they call it side effects, right? But it's one of the long-term effects of them taking the medication is insomnia.
Yes.
So they're only meant to be taken to try and break a cycle. And if you take them long-term, they cause the problem that you're trying to get rid of.
Which is pretty much the same for almost any medication you can think of. Right? If you take a medication for the gut, it does the same thing, right? Anything that's taken long-term disrupts our systems, unfortunately. But we do like those simple answers.
Well,
and not only that, but they cause depression. They cause major links with cognitive. Everyone I know who comes to me on them, they have cognitive issues. And I'm like, well, if we want to deal with the cognitive issues, we're going to have to deal with these meds.
And so, for the sleep thing, there are people who specialize in helping people get sleep without the meds. Mm-hmm. And some of the most useful things are, like you say, have that ritual before bed, get the ritual lets my whole physiological system know I'm going to go into a different mode of operating.
I mean, it's primarily sleep is regulated by the brainstem, which is largely habit, no different than my dog, he knows that at 9 o'clock it's time to go to bed.
So I have people that benefit a lot from doing the EFT tapping
Mm-hmm.
to get to
Tapping
sleep,
you. Yeah.
breath work,
Yeah.
canceling their goals, just reviewing the day really quickly and just letting their mind know, okay, all of this is going on. I try to get this and this and this done, but it's time to go to bed. I'm going to cancel any goals. I'm going to quit worrying about this. Just ask to be shown how to have a restful night's sleep and then see how it works. And some people, just that goal canceling and EFT tapping and breath work works wonders.
Yeah, absolutely. For some, it does. The biggest problem with sleep, I think for all of us, is when you wake up and then there's this frustration, right? We get so frustrated that we can't sleep. And that's where the tapping can really be useful. But that relationship to not being able to sleep is the biggest challenge, and the biggest thing that needs to be kind of, again, the meaning of it needs to shift, because it just keeps us awake longer and longer.
Yeah, if I wake up in the middle of the night and, I wake up, 4 hours or 3 hours before my alarm was supposed to go off and I have to get up and I go, oh, darn, this is horrible. I need to sleep and now I'm not going to get back to sleep. I create all of that tension that makes it more difficult to get back to sleep.
Exactly.
If I wake up and there's 3 hours before the alarm goes off and I say, oh, good, I've got another 3 hours. And I soften and breathe into that, I create an entirely different response.
And often you'll fall asleep. Yeah.
The other thing is, as you mentioned, and I don't want to brush over it too quickly, is a lot of people had trauma around going to sleep, whether it was safe to be asleep, things would happen to them and they would be awakened from sleep and those kinds of things need to be addressed at a, specifically acknowledging, look, I'm carrying energy inside of me in some part of my memory or physiological system that needs to be released. The trauma energy needs to be resolved. Otherwise, I can take all the pills anybody ever wants to throw at me, and I can breathe and tap until my fingers have calluses on them. It won't change.
Yeah. Unless you're using the tapping to work through those particular traumas that led to those fears.
And I just want to, put that in here, that we acknowledge that some of the best things that we find work for people, every once in a while we find somebody that nothing works for them. Yeah. In which case I want to start looking in other areas, and trauma is one of them, right? Hidden release trauma around sleeping, or whether it was safe to be asleep, and or as you were mentioning, if I have a recent event that reminds me of someone or something that was traumatic in the past, it might get me activated so that I can't sleep well through the night.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where you need to put on your detective's cap and try and ask enough questions to get some clues.
Or again, with the EMDR, just tuning into the reactivity in that moment and allowing that to bridge back to whatever it was in the past that's bringing that on.
Yeah, that's been activated.
Yeah.
Well, so, if we have 5 or 7 minutes left, what's something that relates to ACEs and trauma that we haven't even talked about yet, or that you want to go back to and just highlight?
I think a good question, but what we didn't talk about is sort of, in terms of sort of the polyvagal theory, right? So in terms of that third branch, so we all know, most of us recognize that fight, flight, freeze. We've all experienced that, right? Especially the fight and flight. The freeze, some people may not have experienced as much, but that's just when we become immobilized, right? When it's just so overwhelming that there's no other option and we just freeze. But the one that's not talked about as much is the sort of the tend and befriend, the connecting, right? The connection. So I think with trauma, so often there's a lack of trust and a tendency to isolate, right? But I think it's so important to also consider, right, how we'll use EMDR to kind of work through some of the fears, but to start to find those connections, right? Whether that's in groups, whether that's, obviously that's part of what therapy is, but to find people that you can reach out to, and to have that support and to activate that part of the nervous system, which allows it to calm and regulate. To have somebody to be able to co-regulate, that is regulated, that we can be with to help us regulate, right? And I think at times we all need that. That's an essential part of just being a social human being.
Well, and that is so difficult for people who've had a lot of adversity in their childhood, because the adversity becomes what's familiar.
Yes.
And so being around somebody who's comfortable in his or her own skin can seem so unusual, so unfamiliar as to be triggering that fear response or that discomfort response.
Yeah.
People literally will gravitate back towards what's familiar, even though that's unhealthy and painful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's retraining their whole nervous system and their ability to identify that this kind of a vibration or emotional pattern they're getting from somebody is safe and actually valuable. I want to learn to move toward that, to connect with those people.
Yeah. And along that same lines, I think it's so essential, because this is something else that isn't taught certainly in medical school. I don't know about in other areas, but if we're not regulated, we can't help our patients regulate. So then they never get to experience that. Or if they're dysregulating us, then we need to have the tools too to center and calm. And not just therapists and psychiatrists, but that needs to be part of all caretakers in general. It should be part of what we're teaching people, or else that becomes trauma in itself, right? I can't even begin to count the number of times I saw, like when I was in medical school and residency, would see these interactions with these authority figures who were completely dysregulated themselves and would just further traumatize the patient and then blame the patient for becoming dysregulated and seeing, they're the problem. But really, so often it was the people with them. Like I would know as a resident on the nights when I was going to be called to the floor in the middle of the night based on what nurses were on call, right? Because some of them were like so good and so gentle and calming and were able to regulate just about anybody. And then some couldn't regulate anyone. And I would spend the whole night like trying to like fight, right, to counteract that. And it was awful. And by that point, the traditional method is just you're giving them meds. It's awful. And creating just this massive amount of trauma. And I mention it only because, that the whole system is so re-traumatizing. It can be, often is, way too often is. And so I think it's just something it needs to be addressed and thought about.
Well, I'm grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us about that, for the book you wrote on, healing depression without medication, and for your continued work with people to help them wake up to the effects of childhood adversity and integrating that into your practice. I'm honored to know you, and I'm glad that you're willing to share with us.
Well, thank you. It was nice to talk with you again.
It'll be a while, but I'll check back in a while and see how the Qigong teacher training is going.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, blessings. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Dr. Jodie Skillicorn is board certified in psychiatry and neurology and a diplomat of the American Board of Holistic Integrative Medicine. After graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Skidmore College with a BA in English and working for nearly a decade as a photojournalist, she attended Ohio University Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine. She completed her psychiatry residency at Northeast Ohio Medical University. Dr. Skillicorn is the author of the book Healing Depression Without Medications, a psychiatrist's guide to balancing mind, body, and soul. At her private practice in Stowe, Iowa, Dr. Jodie Skillicorn integrates conventional medical training with evidence-based holistic methods that include breathwork, meditation, yoga, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, known as EMDR, emotional freedom techniques, mind-body medicine, nutrition, exercise, and auricular acupuncture. Dr. Skillicorn believes strongly in the body's ability to heal itself if given resources and support, and the importance of empowering patients to take back their own health through simple but effective lifestyle changes.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.